We're ready and we're live.
We're ready and we're live. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. For our workshop tonight, we are fortunate to have Kevin Baumer, the Executive Director of Colorado Municipal League, who is today celebrating his 5th anniversary as the Executive Director.
Wow.
Come back in October when it's my 25th anniversary at CML.
Oh, great. Great.
We'll just make it an annual.
I love it. I love it. And so we invited him up here tonight to talk about the legislation that's working its way through the state legislature as we speak. It's fast and furious. You all might remember last year, there was SB 213 that did not pass. Thanks in a large part to CML standing up for cities and towns like ours. So we're grateful for that. And that's been sort of picked apart into a number of different smaller bills. And so I'd like you to take it away and then we'll have some time for a question at the end.
Yeah, I mean, let me thank you, Mayor, and it's nice to see all of you. When she said, "You really want to come up here on your 5th anniversary?" I said, "There's no place I'd rather be. Get me anytime I get to leave the
City.
downtown core. I'm happy." So, and especially coming out to see members and it is literally part of the job description. So they made sure of that, and I love it. So I do stay pretty up to speed, obviously, on what's going on with our impacting our members at the legislative level. That just by way of history, that in that 25 years, I spent 19 of it in the State House, all but about 6 of that leading our advocacy team. And so I've lobbied a ton of issues. I've seen a lot of things, and I'll just say every legislative session is different. Every administration is different. Every legislature is different. But we're in some pretty unique times right now, and there are some fundamental issues related to governance that I think a lot of state legislators occasionally, unfortunately, our governor we're not on the same page in terms of the importance of what municipalities and counties and special districts do and how the state can be helpful and not preemptive, which has sort of been the theme this year. So let me rewind a little bit. Mayor mentioned Senate Bill 213 last year, which that was 2023. In late 2022, we knew those discussions that were going to lead to legislation were occurring absent any of the local government associations, Colorado Municipal League, Colorado Counties Incorporated, County Commissioners Acting Together, which is another county organization, the Special District Association, or any of the regional associations, Metro Mayor's Caucus, any of the councils of governments, et cetera. And the problem with that was we knew a lot of the things leak out and all that. We knew a lot of things that they were talking about, but they weren't getting any input from local leaders, from elected officials, or certainly staff that has expertise in local land use planning, housing challenges, et cetera. And more importantly, no one was asking, what can the state do to help? So a lot of the presumptions that led to that legislation and some of the legislation that we're dealing with this year seem to be based from at least the municipal league's perspective that local governments, municipalities specifically, are the problem, and the state needs to set policy to overcome those problems, even if they sometimes include incentives. It starts from the premise that local leaders are too responsive, too reactive to folks who don't want to see any kind of development ever going forward. That they are in denial about whether or not there will be any future growth, that they don't know what the future of their cities and towns should look like, Irrespective of how much public engagement there is in those very discussions. And I think based on my tours around the state, it's pretty extensive. People care about the places that they live, and they are, as I don't need to tell all of you, generally not shy about sharing it with you. And so the assumption that local governments were the problem led to some very prescriptive legislation that went through, I don't want to relive last year because it was a whole different session, but it went through multiple iterations when all we were saying is, hey, a lot of the goals you're trying to achieve in terms of density where it makes sense, in terms of housing choice, in terms of affordability, and in support of transit corridors and the appropriate development that occurs along them, et cetera. These are all things generally that most CML members are in agreement with. So telling them they're doing it wrong, as opposed to saying, how can we help you get to where you and folks in your community want to go, that was a conversation that wasn't happening. And so there was no negotiation. They didn't want to negotiate. We were able to, in the last 5 hours of the 2023 legislative session, able to secure enough votes that the bill wasn't going to pass if it had been brought back up again at the Senate. So it just died on the calendar. That kicked off, obviously a lot of discussions and a lot of circles about what comes next. I don't think that the flavor of the opposition, or at least the proponents of 213, really changed that much. More of the discussions that were going on there were how to change strategy to essentially achieve the same outcome within the league and within our membership, and particularly our executive board. We had a more direct conversation about, we know this is going to come back. Shall we wait and see what happens, or should we do our own thing that is built on the themes that we have been proposing? And that's what we did. The board directed us to move forward in that way. We started having stakeholder meetings that included people that were proponents of Senate Bill 213. Anyone and everyone was invited, and they were, it was an extensive invite list. As a side note, it's greatly frustrating, don't you believe it, when anyone says in the current legislative discussion that they weren't included or to get a chance to be included. There's very few things that will get my blood pressure up, but not telling the truth is one of them. But in any event, and that helped craft legislation that has been thoroughly reviewed, stakeholdered, revised, and has been introduced as Senate Bill 174 that has its first hearing tomorrow in Senate Local Government Committee. I still call it Senate Local Government, and they've changed the committee names. So I think local government's actually the last thing. I think it should be the first thing, but Senate Local Government Committee. And I'll tell you, I'm not 100% sure what the outcome is going to be. So stick a pin in that one for a second. I mentioned that the proponents were also spending some time talking about what they were going to do next, and what they decided to do. The determination was made, and you could have seen it some of the press in the months after the legislative session, was they tried to do one big thing when they really should have been breaking it up into smaller bills and trying to get pieces of it. From a strategy standpoint, probably very smart on their part. It's harder to aim at 5 targets than it is at 1 target. And so that's what we have, legislation dealing with occupancy limits, with accessory dwelling units as used by right, with transit-oriented communities, which is directing high density development, irrespective of whether or not transit actually exists or will exist, and myriad other legislation. And so in our review of that, we have the league has proposed that instead of just saying no, we oppose, the league has proposed, if you amend it in this way, that aligns with our motto this session of partnership, not preemption, we could withdraw our opposition because it would align more with how the state can be helpful instead of dictating or taking things away. Those all started as House bills. They have been moving through the House. The Senate Bill 174 is, like I said, in its first committee tomorrow. It's very likely that these may all be percolating in the Senate at the same time, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it presents a really significant choice. If it does all end up in front of the Senate at the same time, it presents a pretty significant choice about whether or not the state pursues legislation that is preemptive, that directs local governments what to do and penalizes them in some cases if they don't. For example, the transit-oriented communities bill, if you don't meet the density requirements that are required in the legislation, and some of them in the housing opportunity goals, they call them, the sort of Damocles hanging over every municipality's head is you don't get your HUTF revenue. What that has to do with housing, I have no idea, but it's intended to force people, obviously, to comply with something. So, amendments that would change things like that and make them more cooperative or supportive of local efforts would be helpful. And the senators are going to be forced with that here, we think, in the next few weeks after the state budget gets through the Senate and present a choice to them. I don't have much faith in the House being helpful unless the handwriting is on the wall that in the Senate there is only one type of bill that can get through. And I don't know where we're at yet. It's with multiple bills, it's harder to keep state legislators focused on specific goals, and that's kind of where we're at this juncture. The unfortunate part for a town like the town of Lyons is one of the arguments that we are able to use, that if the General Assembly gets it wrong in terms of preempting local land use authority, there is recourse or potential recourse for home rule municipalities in the court system to be able to get courts to say what courts have traditionally agreed to, that as a home rule matter, plenary land use authority is a matter of local and municipal concern. The only way to undo any preemptions and mandates on statutory municipalities is to go back and change the legislation if it passes. And I would submit that most of the proponents of legislation that the league is opposing, unless it's amended, really they don't have a town like Lyons in mind. They're thinking about Denver and Aurora and Arvada and Lakewood and all that. And, taking a big wide swath, and whoever gets caught up in it, it's not their problem. So that presents a unique advocacy challenge because most small towns don't have as much representation in the General Assembly. The largest statutory municipality was Erie, and it just went home rule. So it really is a lot of small towns and statutory entities that are going to be left. When we talk about, we don't separate between the two, obviously, when we're talking about the right thing to do. For us, it's a matter of preserving traditional home rule authority as well as local decision-making authority at whatever level of government that occurs. And when you step back and you take a look, we think it makes a lot of sense. Again, knowing that most cities and towns, and it doesn't mean it's smooth sailing all the time, but they have honest conversations with members of the community about not just what should happen now, but what things should look like 20 years from now, knowing that there are probably a lot of people out there that think Lyons would be a great place to live, and they may want to and they may want to do that. Can they? And what about whether it's Lyons or anyone else, a mix, being able to provide a mix of housing so that everyone who wants to live here and work here, irrespective of their income level, can do that. But still, and this is the core thing that no state legislature can do, still preserving the character of the community. Only a handful of state legislators have ever spent any time in any local government setting, and I would submit that only 5% of them maybe have ever been to a planning commission meeting, that understand what happens and, you know, the passion that people come with about their community and what they want to see happen. And unfortunately, that kind of passion, if it doesn't track in the direction that the proponents of some of the legislation we oppose does, then they'll label them NIMBYs and say they're just sticking their head in the sand, and, you know, and dismiss that. That's why they will say that local governments are the problem and that folks need to be told what to do. So very daunting challenges ahead. But you think about the, you know, that basis of local participatory government, and then you look what happened in November of 2022 when voters passed Prop 123. 200 communities, I don't know if Lions is one, 200 communities have signed on and said, hey, we understand that those are some lofty goals, but it aligns with what our long-term vision is, and we want to try to get to that. That's a voluntary effort. No one had to tell you how to do it. You probably had some, you know, discussion about the implications and, you know, and whether or not you'd be able to achieve the targets that are laid out in that. But I think it's exhibit A of the type of leadership that local governments are taking and will take when they have support, particularly the kind of investment it takes to meet some of those goals. And that is a core part of our message down at the state capitol, in that partnership, not preemption, you know, work together. The Senate Bill 174 is titled Sustainable Support for Affordable Housing. It is rooted in ensuring that the state can help support efforts of local governments. Now, here's the part of 174, or the truth about part of 174 that has caused some conversation within the family, and, you know, all cards on the table here. Because we knew what was going to be coming at us or likely to be coming at us and our members from folks that supported Senate Bill 213 last year, we knew we couldn't just say no. There are elements of Senate Bill 174 that do include some requirements on local governments, and some members have said, I don't know if I like that. That looks a lot like a mandate. And I'll say it actually is a mandate, but these are mandates that are likely within the scope of what you would probably be doing anyway. So it would require a housing needs assessment. I understand you've already done a housing needs assessment, so that would you'd be exempt from that. But there are others that haven't, that want to, but this may tell them they have to do it in a way maybe different than they envisioned. So that's one part of it. There are some required considerations for master plan elements, not enforceable. I mean, traditionally master plans are a visionary document, but, you know, water supply planning, for example, and some climate elements of master planning, and conversations that are, if not officially occurring, would are probably out there, and why not include them in the master plan discussion, you know, particularly when you're talking about when things are like 20, 30 years from now. So there are elements in the legislation that some folks have said, well, geez, we don't want to see any mandates. And within the family, it has been a discussion of, okay, but in working with stakeholders who are pushing for more significant mandates, we're getting some of them, like housing advocates, for example, are willing to back off some of those if they see that local governments are making an honest effort and legislation that they support to try to get to some of the same things. So, you you know, when someone says, I've got a problem with Senate Bill 174, it's like, well, how do you like House Bill 1313, the Transit-Oriented Communities Bill? Because if 174 is, it killed somewhere along the way, then those become the only vehicles left that we have to either try to amend or defeat. And again, with multiple bills, that will be more challenging. I'm not a very good prognosticator. I felt pretty good about our chances last year because it was one big bill and we had a lot of momentum. There are a lot of moving parts down at the General Assembly right now, and not just on this issue either. Between budget and property tax issues and other potential or actual initiatives that will be on the fall ballot. There's a lot of noise in the building, and I can't sit here and tell you today how it's going to turn out. I'd love it because that would keep me from turning gray faster, but it's going to take whatever opportunities, when opportunities arise, it's going to take continued communication with particularly state legislators on encouraging them to support, opportunities where the state can help meet the goals of local elected officials that are working with people in the community on long-term planning and discussions that can and need to occur at the local level, and certainly will continue to, even if the state tries to take over everything, right? Folks are still going to come in here and want you to do something and, expect things, and it's, and this is the place to do it. So that's kind of my overview of certainly the housing legislation. I should mention on the other side of, not the other side of things, there's another bill that the league is supporting. One of the things, and I don't know how to the extent this is as applicable as maybe it is in the more urban areas, but one of the things that is generally identified as problematic is where there is new housing development anymore, it's almost all rental housing. And there isn't any middle housing opportunity for, say, folks that have raised their families, the kids wilderness and want to downsize to condos, particularly we're talking about, single family attached housing, smaller footprint. It's just not an option. That's, we agree with the argument that is related to the construction defects litigation that has kept insurance rates for defects so high, and that there's a bill that the league supports, Senate Bill 106, that would strike a little bit better balance, we think, and that have supported the home builders and others that have been advocating for it. Now I want to be real clear. We think that the bill still protects, and this is important, protects individuals that, if there's a construction defect, that they'll still have recourse. It's not a free pass to go, cruddy housing. And that was kind of a critical part of getting to where that legislation is now. So, hope springs eternal. If that passes, irrespective of anything else, we may start to see longer term, it won't happen overnight, where there is new housing approved and opportunity for, a broader mix of housing that will support multiple income levels, even if it was on market rate. But obviously opportunities to build some of that as affordable housing as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions going further into anything that I didn't cover or that you would like me to cover, and I'm keeping my eye on the mayor for when the sign occurs. Yeah, right.
Well, thank you. So I know that our community has expressed some concern about two bills, and specifically, one is the removal of occupancy limits, the removal. Yes. So I'd like it if you could chat about that, and then the ADU bill.
Yeah, those are two, and I'll just be honest, those have slid a little down the priority list in terms of, think of a jar full of political capital you get to start your session with, and you get to spend a little here and spend, you can dump it all into one bill, but then you got nothing left. So we've been trying to allocate that as much as possible, and unfortunately, occupancy limits kind of slid down to the bottom of that list, and not because there's not problems with it, but because I'm writing a wave of support down at the State House to try to get whatever amendments were possible. These are both great examples of whether it's proponents or sponsors or whatever, thinking that this will solve something right now, and they're not thinking 20 years ahead about what communities might look like, and what people, how people will react to those changes. So, I come from the school. I'm not a planner or anything like that, but I've certainly listened to them. I come from the school that, you think about what your community should look like in the future with the concept that place matters. And you can't make everyone happy all the time, but you should be contemplating what are the things that are going to make people remain in their community, support businesses in the community that provide options for everyone, whether it's a housing type or location or whatever, as well as their ability to enjoy the amenities of the municipality and the services that they provide. There is a notion that with the occupancy limits that the municipal ordinances that have set occupancy limits are aimed at lower socioeconomic classes or individuals, and are preventing them from, because of the cost of housing, being able to live in a home. They end up homeless or move away completely. And so that bill was amended to, and let me just say, whether or not they are ultimately enforceable at any level will remain to be seen. But the bill allows municipalities, at least as it was amended, to enforce occupancy limits for health and safety reasons and all that. But it's still possible that, in a single family resident or neighborhood of single family homes, that if the occupancy limit that used to be there is been overturned, there's no health and safety reasons to change it, that you could have a lot more people living there and everyone with a vehicle and parking in the street and whatever. Maybe if it's one house, that's, folks figure out a way to live with that. But if it was every house in the neighborhood, all of a sudden it's going to change the character of a neighborhood. And people leave. It will, may affect property values, and that occupancy limits in and of themselves were not established at the local level to keep anyone out, but more to preserve the character of the neighborhood. The legislature doesn't see it that way, or at least the majority of them do, and they think that by eliminating or restricting occupancy limits at the local level, that will somehow create some relief in the housing problem, housing supply problem. ADUs, kind of the same thing. Now a lot of municipalities, or several municipalities, have had ADU ordinances where they're allowed under certain conditions or many conditions. If you take a look at the January, you can find it on our website, the January edition of Colorado Municipalities Magazine, it was our legislative edition, and our research analyst wrote a wonderful article on ADUs and municipalities that have them, and both successes and challenges. And the takeaway from that is they can be helpful, not a panacea. And they're not, they're not appropriate at a physical level everywhere. You can't just stick an ADU in any lot. And if you do, then there are other considerations that have to be taken into account. Infrastructure, whether or not there's enough parking, for example. If there were a lot of them, you have to also contemplate impacts on fire service and everything else. That legislation could be a little bit more challenged, and I go back to home rule municipalities here, but, they may have an opportunity, depending on how the legislation ends up, to strike out at that, because the legislation would create ADUs as a use by right, and that strikes at the, traditional local land use authority. And I should say this, if a home rule or a group of home rule municipalities succeed in overturning anything, my guess is, since they would still apply to statutory entities, it's just a matter of going back and saying, well, if you can't do it for statutory or home rule municipalities, you need to repeal the law, and that would probably be something that the league would take up. I think it's important to note that many or most of these bills purport to overrule conflicting HOA covenants, and there won't be anything that the municipality can do about that, whether it wanted to or not. Ultimately, that will be something that a homeowners association or the representatives would have to determine was, whether or not it changed an existing contractual relationship. The legislature shouldn't be able to overturn or take away, and they may have a right to try to pursue legislation in that regard. I have no, idea of like the legal ramifications of that, or whether or not it would be not something that would be successful if challenged. But I think the important thing is there are some pieces of legislation that are aimed not prospectively, but certainly intrusively, and there wouldn't be anything that municipality or a county in an unincorporated area could do it. Is that helpful response?
Yeah, and so just for folks who might not be as familiar, the occupancy limit legislation removes, and tell me if I get this wrong, please.
Yeah.
Removes the ability of the municipality to enforce any occupancy limits. Right. So the HOA question is essentially, to put it simply, so if a municipality can't enforce occupancy limits, can an HOA? Based on their contractual relationship with people who live in it. And the ADU ordinance, as I understand it, would allow ADUs as a use by right anywhere. We have an ADU ordinance that's working really well. Good. And so many staff members and board members put so much time and energy into creating it and revising it over the years. What about design standards for ADUs in this legislation?
Yeah, I'm not as versed on where that stands right now. Let me go back a second though. One of the things that's problematic about the ADU legislation is that where that hard work has occurred and where the ADU ordinances are on the books, whether there's, they've been used or not, and, whether to what extent, would still be preempted, and you'd have to then follow the state standard. And so I'll just say at the very least, if we think that legislation is going to pass, we're at least going to try to get, and this is a bit, well, I'll come back to the gamble side of it. We're gonna at least try and get language in there that honors a local ordinance. And to my mind, whether it's been previously adopted or is adopted in the future, because those are very local discussions. The gamble is if you amend legislation to quote unquote make it better, and there might have been a chance to defeat it if otherwise, you kind of kick yourself after the fact, but you don't really know. I think this one is probably has legs. And so we'd be well off to try to assist our members that have already gone through that process, and any that may want to in the future to say we'd rather do our own thing aside from whatever the state legislation is. And I don't think it would close the door on, although I'm not an attorney, that's what Dittman's for, but I don't think it would close the door on municipalities, particularly home rule municipalities, from trying to challenge that. As a unconstitutional preemption of the local land use authority, then we have that discussion again.
And again and again.
And again and again. Yeah. So
since we're a statutory town, what's your advice for us? We we as a board decided, I think it was in 2023, that generally we oppose any legislation that removes local authority over
Yeah.
land use. And so we don't typically discuss these bills at length during our meetings. What would your advice be for a statutory town to continue to advocate for ourselves?
I mean, ask your senator and representative where they're at, right?
Yeah.
And I say this, outside of any legislation, that goes for, whether the legislature's in session or not, it's great to, I tell every city in town, you get a chance, invite your members of your delegation and show them around what you've been doing and tell them what they can do to help. There are some members that, don't do that and then try to reach out when they need something. And, it's harder for a legislator to respond if that's the first time they hear from them. It is true that statutory entities are at the mercy of whatever the state ultimately adopts in legislation, unless they go so far afield, there's other problems with it, but I think it's perfectly appropriate stance to say, we can do this and are doing this, here's how you can help, we're gonna oppose any preemption efforts. There are other things I'm not gonna, because I don't want to get an email from Brandon, but so I'm not gonna stray into legal advice. There are potential other avenues. I'll just say that no one has, done this in a long time. There is a state statute prohibiting unfunded mandates on local governments. And which, it comes as a surprise to a lot of state legislators too. The only problem with it is the remedy is if it's determined that there's an unfunded mandate, the remedy is the local government can ignore the mandate. Well, that's when the problems may start. If you get sued then for not following the law, you have to defend yourself, use that and say, well, the state didn't supply funding for the mandate, and that's what the law says it's supposed to. It may or may not be the best defense. The last time it was tried was Weld County, I think, tried it decades ago in responding to a mandate on healthcare services or health services, and the state said, no, well, you're an arm of the state, so you have to do it. I don't know if it would follow the same logic or not. There's another one. Speaking of Sam Mamet, take notes, Dittman. We are waiting for, at some point in time, the stars to align, and it would mean something bad had to happen. So maybe not waiting with too much excitement, but waiting for a local government to challenge an unfunded mandate on a one sentence that is in the taxpayer's Bill of Rights, that even though trying to read, like a lot of the taxpayers' Bill of Rights is like trying to read Greek, it appears to clearly prohibit state unfunded mandates. It's in the Constitution. That has a lot more weight and is, and it doesn't matter if it's home rule or not, if it's in Tabor. So it would be an interesting test case someday. But I hope it's never that bad that someone has to try it.
Mayor Bertram?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm curious. Do you have any sense of the state perhaps taking over housing authorities so that there are no longer independent communities that are nonprofit run to, purposefully remain affordable? One community I'm thinking of is like the nonprofit organization Boulders Thistle. So is there a chance that the state would take over all housing authorities and then companies or organizations like that would be out?
I don't think so.
Okay.
First of all, I don't think they've got the fiscal, in spite of, passing a ginormous budget. The state wouldn't have the resources to be able to run anything like that and have the, and be able to give itself the spending authority to do it. No, I think, and I don't want to be glib here. I think, It's more in the line of saying this is what you need to do and maybe providing some resources that fit a specific vision, but not enough resources for the type of impacts that it would create at the local level.
Okay.
Yeah.
So similar to like the electric vehicles and electric equipment, they're offering some incentives to do that, but it is a mandate.
Yeah.
And for small communities like ours, we've, it will take about $60,000 a year to make that change happen. But
Yeah.
I'm not seeing that kind of funding being released.
And whether or not it'll be sustainable, whether or not, the next legislature will say, as we go year to year on the budget and one legislature can't bind the next in terms of fiscal commitments. And then there are resources that maybe could supplement some of those efforts. Energy impact assistance funds at the Department of Local Affairs. Well, in the budget that is going through the legislature right now, the state is siphoning another $25 million out of the local government impact fund to fund state priorities in the state budget.
Yeah.
And the response, this one's a long-term one for me, because during 2008 to 2013, the state backfilled the state budget with about $400 million of local impact dollars that are used for infrastructure and, particularly if you think back to the 2008 recession, the time when infrastructure investment would have created a lot of jobs. Not one nickel that's ever been paid back. And in 2015, they took 25 million, 20 million to backfill TABOR refunds that year. So in good times they were taking it. Now they're doing it again because they got other spending priorities and tax credits and all that, when those dollars could be put to use. And the line you get is why that's okay is, well, that was just excess money. It was being held in reserve. So it had a big target on it, and why was it being held in reserve? It should have been going out to municipalities and counties and special districts for projects, whether they be green projects or water infrastructure, or the many things that the Energy Impact Fund is used for. So, sorry, that one got me.
Well, and unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the accessibility, but maybe, I know Brandon's been keeping an eye on that. So does anyone have any final questions for Kevin before we send him on his way to celebrate his 5th anniversary as the executive director? Thank you so much
You betcha.
for coming up here.
Thanks for the invite. I encourage you, if you're not getting our State House report, our newsletters, do you get, if you, are you all getting the newsletters in your email? Good, excellent. You get them about a week earlier. There's some people still like the paper copy. For lots of reasons, I encourage folks to get the e-version because you get it faster and you know what's going on. But always feel free. I'm gonna leave my cards with Victoria. You can reach out to me anytime. My cell phone number's on there. And good luck getting through the election tomorrow with I think about 100 other municipalities, sanctuary municipalities.
Yeah.
This actually, real quick, I want to give you a success story about how local governments do it better. April of 2020. 1 month into COVID. 100 municipalities are trying to figure out, okay, so we have all these health orders. We have an election to run here. But clerks had already had it all figured out. And we got approached the municipal league. Governor Polis wants to, is going to write an executive order directing municipalities, statutory municipalities, how to conduct their elections. And he did end up issuing the executive order after lots of feedback from CMCA, Municipal Clerks Association clerks about exactly everything that they had done. And he just basically reiterated that in the executive order. He pulled it off. We had successful elections in the most daunting challenges and the most daunting times. So tomorrow will be nothing.
Tell that to Clerk Baskets.
Yeah.
You'll be fine.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you again.
Happy to come back anytime.
We'll come back when the weather's a little nicer. We'll do the golf cart.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, and then we'll have you come up and do some board training. Or something.
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be
more
great.
than happy to do that.
Yeah,
I have a whole thing. And we'll talk one bit
He
about the
does, yes.
legislature.
We'll present it.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're very welcome.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and call the Monday, April 1st Board of Trustees meeting to order. Do we have the roll call, please?
Yes, Mayor Rogan,
Present?
Mayor Pro Tem Farrell,
Present?
Trustee Elson,
Present.
Trustee Dottie,
Present.
Trustee Edding, Trustee Dahmen,
Present.
and Trustee Williams.
Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
So first on our agenda tonight, there will be a motion, I believe, to go into executive session. And that executive session, if passed, will last until about 7 o'clock when the regular board meeting will start. So, I will ask for motion to go into executive session.
I move to go into executive session pursuant to CRS 24-6-4024F for the purpose of discussion of personnel issues and Town Administrator Simonson's performance review. Town Administrator Simonson was previously informed of the meeting and does not wish to have the discussion in open session.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion?
I mean, somewhere else.
I'll call for the vote.
That motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Do you want to send over the language to me,
I'm
please?
sending it right now.
And then, if you're online, the same link will be active at 7 o'clock for the rest of our